monthly gift. So you might want to stick around. I want to thank VMware for sponsoring the reception last night. Food, beer. I also hear the hackathon was pretty fun. A lot of people were there, seemed to be pretty busy and active, and of course, beer, prizes. So thanks to Red Hat for that. All the keynotes will be available online, so if you want to, shortly after the show, if you want to actually go back and look at one of the keynotes, or your colleagues need to look at one of the keynotes, the recordings will be up there. You'll be able to see them. That's it. So actually, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew, and Matthew's going to run this Zend Framework 2 Practical Experiences from the Trenches keynote. And Matthew, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Kent. So we thought it would be interesting with the ZF2 released about 6 weeks ago. Interestingly, a lot of people have been adopting ZF2 for quite some time now, and these are 3 people who I've been working with over the course of the last 6 months who I know are in the trenches and actually following the betas and the breakages and all that stuff that happened as we got to a stable release. So I wanted to invite them to come up here and share some of that. You guys are expected to come to one of these 2 mics and ask them questions. I'm going to throw low balls right now, and if you want something interesting, please come up here. I know there's Liz should be out here, and Lorna and a few others. So yeah, I'm sure they'll come up if you don't. So if you want something really interesting, come on up. I'm going to have each of them introduce themselves first. I want you to tell me who you are, who you've worked for using Zend Framework 2, because I know a couple of you have moved around since we originally invited you, and what you're building with Zend Framework 2. So, go ahead, Shawn.
I'm Shawn Stratton. I work with Discovery Communications, which is a nice way of saying I work for the Discovery Channel. And we've been using Zend Framework 2 since last year at ComCon.
Oh, that was really early. That was before
so we've been using it for quite a while, and we're actually building several things with it. Mainly, we're using it for a SOA platform. So it's actually our service core for all of our front-end sites.
My name is Mike Willbanks. I was at CaringBridge, so I'm the one that he referenced that had moved. I started with Zend Framework 2 probably before the first beta at some point. And we had built kind of our own platform infrastructure on it to kind of gear up, 3, 4, or 5 different sites. And there's constant rework that was constantly going on with it.
And where are you now?
I'm now at Barnes & Noble.
My name is Evan Coury, and I was with Southwest Medical. I'm still with them in a way. Now they're actually one of my clients instead. And we have built and are building a e-commerce platform on Zend Framework 2 that's open source actually. It's called Spec Commerce. And in addition to that, also I run my own company on the side that's an SMS gateway, and we're building the second version of our SMS platform on Zend Framework 2 as well.
So Evan, since you have the microphone right now, Evan's been heavily involved with the development of Zend Framework 2 as well. We mentioned this last night at one point, but I do a lot of prototyping basically, and then I throw ideas over the fence and then hope somebody's going to run with them. And Evan is one of those people who did that. The fact that we have a module manager and that you have the ability to basically drag and drop a module into your application and have it just run is largely due to the efforts of Evan here. So Evan, I'd like you to talk about what was the impetus for you doing the module manager. What was it going to help you solve with the projects that you were working on?
Okay, so one of the largest problems we had at Southwest Medical, we were evaluating the e-commerce platforms that were out there, the open source ones, the commercial ones, all of them. And we had some issues because we had unique needs, very unique needs. Selling medical equipment, you have like wheelchairs that are extremely complex products. You'll have hundreds of options on these products, and then those options will have sub-options, which will have sub-options, and you customize everything down to the last measurement. We have unit of measures for different products and different distributors and different manufacturers for the same kind of product, and really interesting use cases that make it extremely hard to use prepackaged e-commerce software. So when I joined them, they were using a custom-built PHP e-commerce platform that was not the best thing in the world. So I immediately rewrote it in Zend Framework 1 after deciding that there's no way we could possibly mold anything like Magento or OS Commerce or anything into what we needed, at least not in a cost-efficient way. So we refactored into Zend Framework 1, and finally we grew out of that to where we needed to restructure the database schema, which I was using the old one still. And that's about when Zend Framework 2 was coming into life. And the problems that we had where we had these use cases, but so much of our application was common. It frustrated me that we were building stuff like user authentication in a shopping cart where that's just such common functionality that you should not have to be programming as a programmer because it's been written 500 times. So I was frustrated about reinventing that stuff just because we couldn't afford to hack these other packages to what we needed. So I've had this idea of modules for a long time. I actually built a couple versions of a module platform on top of Zend Framework 1 before doing the Zend Framework 2 version. And so we got to a point where when I decided to build the Zend Framework 2 module manager that I was determined that we would be able to use these pieces of functionality and not have to reinvent every single thing. So that was really the main motivation. It was to save time, save money, and be able to more efficiently focus on the problems of your application that are unique to your application. And now we have the module manager. So.
A reminder, there are microphones up here. If you have questions for them as they're talking, please do.
Please.
Mike, one of the things that you did, Mike has been contributing to Zend Framework, both versions 1 and 2. One of the last things he did for 1.12, which we released not long ago, was push technology for mobile. So being able to do notifications for Android, for Apple iOS, and that sort of thing from your PHP applications. So you've done a lot with mobile. And so I'm wondering how Zend Framework 2 has impacted your ability to do mobile support. What has it enabled you to do in different ways?
Well, I mean, a lot of CaringBridge's infrastructure was based off of a lot of APIs because we had a iOS application and an Android application. So that's why I built the Zend mobile component that had all the push notifications in 1.12 because we had a sophisticated Gearman worker system that kind of pushed them all. So with Zend Framework 2 kind of coming in, we're still leveraging some of the 1.12 work as I, try to port things over and redo them for 2.0. But I mean, you now have like the RESTful controller, whereas before you had Zend REST, and it was kind of backwards, to say the least.
It's awfully charitable.
Yeah, well. So I mean, we were using JSON RPC at first, so you can still use that in 2.0 now. You can use JSON RPC, XML RPC, or SOAP, but overall, I mean, it does work a lot better. And with the RESTful controller, I mean, you seriously want to just consider not using those servers anymore and doing the RESTful stuff because it really kind of optimizes your workflow and makes everything very consistent.
Excellent. Shawn, so you've been working at Discovery, and I know that you guys have an interesting architecture in that Zend Framework isn't necessarily what's powering the website, it's behind the scenes. So can you talk about a little bit about what you've developed so far and what you're doing with ZF2?
Well, to start off with, we've been using Zend Framework since, very, very early. We're talking about pre-1.0 days. So we actually still have code somewhere in production that's from 0.7, I think. So, we've been using it for a long time, and when Zend Framework 2 started coming out, we started using the components in our original application. So we were using the autoloader, the class map autoloader, and we saw massive performance gains by making very simple changes. So we got a business directive to start moving to a SOA platform. So we started moving away from the front-end verticals having access to the database and having access to Solar or the search servers and things like that. So we needed to write a platform that would be able to provide that access to these front ends to give them the data that they requested. Having had so much background in Zend Framework, we decided that we were going to go with Zend Framework, and that was about the time that Zend Framework 2 was announced. When this was pre-beta 1. We started on this work before last year's ZendCon. So it was definitely a long time ago. We now have a working platform that's based on Zend Framework 2. It's in production, and most likely if you're hitting discovery.com, You're either hitting our legacy Java application, which we're migrating away from, or you're hitting either a Python or a PHP front end that's talking to Zend Framework for its data.
Cool. So a couple of you have mentioned, using Zend Framework 1 and going to Zend Framework 2. How would you characterize the experience of migration, and what were some of the pain points? What were you able to do better? That sort of thing. So whoever wants to jump in. Seriously, there's 2 microphones here. Don't make me do all the work.
I will definitely go first on this one.
Okay.
Programming in Zend Framework 2 versus Zend Framework 1 is like going from Linux to Mac. It's a massive paradigm shift. Everything has to be basically relearned. Some of the conventions are still true, and some of the code still pretty much works the same way. But it's definitely not the same thing. It's not an incremental improvement. It's a vast improvement. And there's definitely a learning curve to it too.
So when we built out our first Zend Framework 2 app at CaringBridge, it was I don't know, a enlightening experience. That was during like beta 1, beta 2, and everything had to be configured with DI. So kind of trying to get from 1 to 2 at that point in time was, it took about a week of, blank staring and walking out into the parking lot and, not really remembering what's going on anymore. Zend Framework 2 as it's released now is a lot better. There's all these service factories which actually increase performance tenfold. I mean, if you look at the bootstrapping process from Zend Framework 1 and how Zend application was taking like 200 to probably 400 milliseconds at times to bootstrap your application, you no longer really have that with all the service factories. And so I have to say that that's one of the best features of basically migrating. Actually trying to get through the migration, I mean, you do end up rewriting a lot of things. You can kind of do it in parallel, since you can load up Zend Framework 2 and start including some of the files. But when you have to go through the MVC, that's when the time you have to basically sit down and focus on rewriting everything. But you can kind of get through your modules and converting over to like ZendDB2 and all of the other fun utilities that are in there.
Well, I kind of lucked out because I was one of the few people that got to kind of start fresh with Zend Framework 2. We basically decided to just stop supporting our ZF1 stuff and really focus on the new stuff. However, we did have our ZF1 stuff completely separated out with the service layer. So the fact that we did that actually enabled us to reuse a lot of stuff, and when we're pulling stuff over, we're adding features to spec commerce. We can just pull a lot of stuff, straight from our ZF1 code base, because it's separated out in a nice clean service layer. So if you are looking to upgrade from ZF1 to ZF2, if you've designed your application well and actually separated things out in the service layer, you won't actually have too much trouble migrating. It's if you're doing, SQL in your controllers and horrible, terrible things that I know none of you would ever be doing, so this shouldn't be a problem at all. Those things you might actually run into some issues trying to upgrade, and it'll make it, a larger headache. But overall, it's been a really positive experience. One thing that's been really interesting to me is how to take one massive application and decide how are we going to break this up into different modules. And it turns out that a lot of our functionality is so common that it can just become these open source modules that we can give to everybody. We needed user authentications immediately, and so we created ZFC user. It was actually EDP user originally, and then I realized that everybody in their dog was making a user module for Zend Framework 2, so we had to put a stop to that pretty quickly. And so we made ZF Commons, an organization to work on some common modules and focus the development there. And but yeah, like a lot of functionality in your applications, you almost wouldn't believe how much of it is just really common stuff. And then you just get to focus on what's unique to your application.
Cool. We have a question. This is great.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what do you recommend in terms of getting your developers up to speed on ZF2, since it is really different, the paradigm's different, and they may be pushback in terms of we don't need to go that way, we're good with what we have, and just whatever you guys have run into.
Well, I didn't really get any pushback because I was the one that made the decision. So, maybe they'll have a better answer for you there. But as far as getting your developers up to speed, okay, the documentation, we're working on it. There's a very good tutorial by Rob, who's over there. It is an excellent starting place. Send them to that, have them go through it, clone the skeleton application, just kind of get your hands dirty. It's worth just a couple hours to really get a good understanding of what Zend Framework 2 is and how it works. So I'd say that's probably the best place to start there.
I'll also say Zend is offering Zend Framework 2 Fundamentals course now, and there's a new one starting up in November, but there will be ongoing online as well. So that will be a good place as well. And then, of course, if you've been here, you probably got a lot of training if you were going to the right sessions. So we have questions over here as well.
Hi there. Just with regard to moving the project over to GitHub, there was an excellent talk about GitHub, a great introduction to it that Lorna Mitchell delivered. It might be interesting for everybody to understand what your experience was like with managing the project on GitHub.
I guess that one's for me. Yeah, so we made that decision fairly early. We actually made the decision to go from Subversion to Git, and the reason being that, well, there are several. One is, in case you're not aware, Zend doesn't actually control the whole thing, the whole project. A bulk of the code is actually coming from community members, which means that we're distributed across the world. The people we have up here are all in the US, but there's a ton of people out here that are contributing who are from various places in Europe and abroad, all over the world. I'm working with people in probably about 14 time zones on a daily basis. So we're distributed by nature, so it makes sense to use a distributed version control system. It has meant making some changes with how we actually do the management of the project. In the past, with Subversion, central repository, you give somebody access to push and they can commit directly. That has its upsides and its downsides. It means that people can just be pushing in all the time. The downside is that there's not a whole lot of review going on in that sort of system. Doing Git meant that pull requests had to come in and somebody had to review it before it got into the mainline trunk or the master. And so that was an amazing thing. I've gone from doing occasional review here and there as I hear that there are issues or I see a big commit coming in to I'm looking at practically every piece of code that comes in. And it's not just me. I'm able to delegate that. Anybody on my team can push. Anybody on the community review team. Evan is one member there, Rob over there as well. And Ben Schultzen. So we've got like half the review team here today. Any of them can do it as well. What that has done is it's improved the quality and the consistency amazingly. And that's like the biggest difference that we've had by using Git. It's just there's a bigger focus on code review versus just committing code and getting it into the system. I think that's probably the best way to characterize it. It's been a fantastic process, and I'm very pleased with the switch at this point. I wouldn't go back in a million years. Yeah, there was also, that Mike brings up a good point. We used to have a contributor's license agreement that any contributor had to sign in order to commit code and for us to even review it. And we decided that it didn't make a whole lot of sense anymore. Back when Zend Framework started, those of you who remember SCO and all the litigation suits against Linux at the time, there was a big worry about how can we use open source within the enterprise. Those concerns are largely gone at this point. People aren't worried terribly about that. So we got rid of the CLA. That was the next bit. No CLA. Everything's on GitHub. Anybody can do a pull request. Floodgates were open. And to give you an idea, during the beta, actually during the RC process, those were happening every, 2 weeks? Yeah, every 2 weeks. Oh, no, it was every 1 week. That's right. We were doing RC every week. I was merging around anywhere between 60 and 100 pull requests a week. It was crazy. And it's just because we had that many people with eyeballs on the code, and they could do anything from small little typographical changes to, hey, we need to make this more consistent, and giving a nice big pull request with that. So we had a question there, and then we'll be over that way. We'll bounce back and forth.
First of all, thank you guys for everything you do. It's been truly enjoyable working with you guys online all year this year. My question has to do with configuration. There's a change now from ZF1 to ZF2 where you no longer have environments in your configuration. You basically have global and local now. And one of the challenges we're facing is as we roll from development to stage to production, the configuration changes and we need to deploy those changes. And I was wondering if you guys have any strategies that you're employing to make those configurations stay in sync.
So yeah, we had that same issue at CaringBridge. And so I know Evan doesn't agree with me and likes his local configuration to be there. I don't like it there. So we basically just grabbed where the configuration would usually normally go and implemented the interfaces and basically set the an Apache environmental and grabbed the environmental and then basically merged the configuration on our own to actually add it in. What you can also do is you can also set the environmental and just push it into the glob pattern if you want to as well. And so you can kind of do it both ways. That way you don't have to have a local file on each one of them, so that if you have like 20 different boxes and 20 different environments, that you forget about one, and then it makes it a little bit better and more central, in my opinion. But I'll let Evan answer his reasoning.
Well, I'm not going to push my strategy, but typically I'll put a local config file in each environment that matches the config for that, and that is outside of source code repository. There are several reasons for that. Additionally, there's other things I like to put in the local config files, like which usually are environment specific, like credentials and stuff that you do not want in your source code control. That is bad. But like you said, one thing I've recommended, it's on my blog. If you search for application or environment specific configs, you can just put the environment variable. If you have like an application_env variable, system variable, you can just put that in the glob pattern in your application.ini or application.config.php. Ooh.
The INI file, I don't think you
Going back to ZF1, are we?
No, actually in the INI you can use constants, but no, yeah, just put that constant into the glob pattern, and you can include your production and your staging and your testing config values right there, and those will just be merged in with everything else.
Yeah, I've done that as well, where I put the environment as just part of the glob pattern. But what Evan said there was actually, there's a really good point, is that part of the reason we made that change is that with Zend Framework 1, you have all your different environments in the same file. Well, that means you're typically putting your credentials in there as well. You don't want that in your version control, especially if it's public at all, or there's a whole lot of reasons. So this is the reason we did it. The other thing is that because you have the glob patterns, you can specify another directory. So one of the ways I deploy often is I have a private repository that, because you want to have some sort of backup and record of changes for those credentials and everything. I'll have a private repository with that, and then I add that into the glob pattern so that if it exists, it will try and glob files from there. Otherwise, it just does it from the application itself. And that way I can have the local ones even separated out of the tree entirely, and that makes the deploy process that much simpler as well. Question over there.
So as this talk is about, you guys are all early adopters of Zend Framework 2, and a lot of the questions have been around migrating from Zend Framework 1 to Zend Framework 2. I'm kind of just curious and interested, is since pre-alpha, alpha, beta versions of Zend Framework 2, obviously it's changed a lot from the stable version it is now. So what are some of the headaches and heartaches that you had building production applications around an unstable framework?
Beta 3. There were several times where massive backward compatibility breaks were introduced. And the biggest challenge you really have working with anything that's not stable is that at the end of the day, you still have to answer to somebody. So you have to answer to business requirements. And it becomes hard to introduce, oh, we need to change this because the technology has changed, when they see that it still works. They don't understand. So that was probably the biggest challenge. And I'll be the first to tell you, we still have some things that are stuck on beta 2. It's in our list of things to do to fix, but we have several applications that are running on Zend Framework 2, and one of them is still stuck on beta 2. So.
Yeah.
Sure, I guess I'll answer as well. The massive backwards compatibility breaks were enormous. Like I said before, DI, that was really hard to kind of get. First you have to kind of learn how the approaches are going to work with the DI environment, and then when service factories came around, then you had to redo it all again. That was pretty difficult, but I had the fun experience of having a bug that was only triggered in some really weird condition in DI. And if you have to try to diagnose the dependency injection portion of that, it's not fun. I spent about 8 hours just trying to write a unit test after I found out how to fix it. So the amount of time it took me to find even how to fix it was bad. But then even trying to reproduce it, because you had to kind of, you couldn't just say, here's my full application, here, just write in the unit test. So I think that was probably one of the bigger pain points. Also, there was a lot of moving things, because when Zend Framework 2 kind of first started hitting alpha and betas, everything was not refactored. So you were still using basically Zend Framework 1 components, just basically in a new namespace format. And so anytime there was, a significant change to it or a rewrite, you ended up having to sit there and rewrite everything regarding that component. So oftentimes it'd be like 2 per beta release, or if you weren't staying up with master, it could be very hard.
It's a good question. The other thing is, you went through all that trouble to debug your DI issues, and then we kind of unofficially deprecated DI right after that and said, go ahead and use a service.
There's nothing unofficial about it. We just said no.
No. So it was challenging, especially working on a large project from the beginning. We were starting our project around last ZendCon. It was like beta 1. It really predates beta 1 when we were working on it. So I would have to agree that the business side of things was challenging. Answering to a meeting of why we had to spend a week refactoring for a BC break, that's expensive. It adds up. Luckily, I was able to justify it, because long term, this whole modular way of going just saves so much time, so much money that it's just unbelievable. That the amount of effort that you don't have to put into really stupid things. So it was a trade-off. All of you coming into a stable Zend Framework 2 have a very large advantage, that you get all these advantages of the modules, and you don't have to go through the hell of trying to keep up with the framework that is under development. One thing I tried to do was synchronize our development for our project with Zend Framework 2 development. So I would put off certain things that I knew had not been refactored yet until they were refactored, and I would get involved with the person that was doing the refactoring to kind of look at how it was going to change and how it was going to actually look. And I tried to synchronize that as much as possible to minimize the amount of wasted time and money that we spent developing for stuff that was just going to change anyway. So that would be my advice if you are trying to develop on early software, would be try to synchronize your development with the project.
We have a question here as well.
Yes, so I'm kind of interested in hearing more about using ZF2 on the back end. So this is probably a question more for Shawn. I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit about some of the ZF2 components that you're using, how you're using them, and then as a developer with no ZF1 or ZF2 experience, what are some components we can kind of focus in on to help us wrap our heads around how that's being done?
So the way we basically started, we started before Zend View was actually written. So we wrote a module based upon the RESTful talks I listened to last year when I was here. Mm-hmm. So we have content negotiation, and that's basically our view layer. The basic modules that we're using, the basic components of Zend Framework are just the MVC. We've integrated with Doctrine using, what was it, Zend Doctrine module.
Yeah, Doctrine module.
That's been a great help, because in the past with Zend Framework 1, we actually wrote our own modeling layer, and it was not pretty. I'm sure the other people have that same experience too, but the very basics, though, as I said, we use the MVC stack, we use the routing stack. We've heavily modified the routing stack because we look at our routes, our stems, and look them up in the database to figure out how we're going to route, into the controllers that we need to. But it's just the very basic Zend Framework 2 components, the ones that everybody needs to start with: request response, the HTTP stack, the MVC stack. So.
Any of you? I think Evan would like to take it.
So you asked about like developing on the back end with Zend Framework 2. For the SMS gateway that I run, smscloud.com, we are refactoring our API, which is just all back-end stuff that is customer-facing. We're using JSON RPC for that, and it's a treat because one nice thing that we found with RPC is that there's a clear specification, unlike REST. So when you have customers that are using your API and you want them to be able to consume it as easy as possible, you can just point them, hey, here's the library, here's the method name, here's the parameters, and they don't really have an excuse of why they can't get it to work. On the back end, also, like just interacting with the database and service layers and stuff like that, Zend Framework 2 has been really, really, really nice. It's so easy to create a clean service layer in Zend Framework 2 with the service manager and get the service into the controller in a clean way, and just all of that stuff is just so much improved, and that's really the emphasis that we're pushing with Zend Framework 2 is good design as well, and it allows you to create a back end for your application that is just beautiful. So yeah.
Well, good. We have somebody come out for a question. Good timing.
We could give away an elephant.
I love elephants. I'll accept any.
Oh, wrong. There we go, Buzz.
Cool. Well, hopefully it's deserving of an elephant. One of the things I've enjoyed most about ZF1 is just the fact that it's so decoupled that you can use individual components, individual modules, even necessarily not without adopting the whole framework. And I'm curious, and I was afraid, you know, when I'm thinking about ZF2, okay, they're going to couple everything so tightly that I can no longer just grab the database component and use that or whatever. Have there been any philosophical changes in your thought process towards the framework? I'm really curious about that, and I'm also curious, what are some of the new patterns that you guys began to use in developing this framework as opposed to what we saw in ZF1?
So it's actually interesting you say that about the components, because I'd say ZF2, we've made it even easier to consume them at this point individually with their dependencies. We have both Composer and Pyrus support, and either one of those, you can install an individual component. It will grab all the dependencies for that one, but you don't need to have the entire framework at all for it. Interestingly, even when I write a module, I don't usually say, you know, it depends on Zend Framework. I say the exact components I need to use so that if somebody wants to use this elsewhere, they can actually do that. So it's actually far better in that way as well. In terms of patterns that we're using, we're really trying to get away from you know, singletons and registries and that sort of thing. And so we're looking at dependency injection. We didn't end up using the dependency injection container, but we're still doing inversion of control, so where we're actually doing the dependency injection. And that's a huge change. It's harder to wrap your head around, but what it opens you up to do is amazing. If I need to substitute anything at any level of it, I can just define that within my factories, and it will go and do it. The other part is doing things event-driven and being able to use events in order to modify the behavior of the system without necessarily needing to extend classes and everything to do it. It gives you an immense amount of freedom and control at a very granular level throughout the framework and throughout the application.
And a follow-on question, I'm very interested in the event-driven model. Is there a pattern or is there, I don't know, a framework for using that in my own applications?
Yeah, you can grab the event manager, and there's certain interfaces like Event Manager where if you're using the service manager, it will automatically inject that.
Right.
But even if you're not using the framework as a whole, you can use the event manager, compose it in, and trigger events from there and attach listeners to it as well.
Very good, thank you.
Any other questions? You're going to make me go to my crib sheet. Great. Okay, so what's your favorite Zend Framework 2 feature? So I'll have each of you answer that one, and
I have to think
somebody
about
will
it for a
start coming
second.
up.
Modules. Can you tell? No, absolutely, the modules. Both from a technical perspective and a business perspective, they make sense. They make a lot of sense. I'm starting to repeat myself at this point, but I mean, just not having to develop stupid stuff. The modules are amazing.
So while Mike's thinking about his, oddly enough, my favorite is definitely the inversion of control and because of the modular system and version of control, we've actually achieved 100% unit coverage on the code that we've written. That was not possible in Zend Framework 1. I don't think it's possible in most frameworks. And it's definitely not possible if you're writing everything by yourself. So we assume that Zend Framework 2 is well tested and covers itself. So we can just focus on what business logic we need in testing that. And that's been a tremendous help to us. So.
All right, I did think of mine. I'm kind of partial to it because when it was in beta 1 or 2, there was the kind of rewritten sessions, and then they kind of worked as long as we were going to store it on the file system. So I had to do a lot of work on that package specifically, and you would not believe how easy it is now to change the basically the session storage. The session storage is basically completely decoupled from the entire Zend session containers. And it makes it very, very, very easy to say, like, you want to use like PHP Redis extension, and they have a session handler in it. You can just pass in one flag and you're off. You don't have to write a whole bunch of code to try to change the session manager anymore. And that was kind of nice, because before, we were using memcache to store our sessions, and we were also using it as a cache, and so I had to inadvertently basically try to reuse the same connection and inject it into different places. And in ZF1, I had to kind of write a tricky little session handler piece that took a lot, and you no longer would have to do that.
So when are you getting me documentation for this again?
Well,
I've been bugging him since July. So.
Well, somebody else said that they were going to write it finally, so yeah, I'll get you documentation at some point. It will get done.
Cool. Any other questions? Seriously, 2 microphones. So, oh, we have a taker. Yes.
This is actually on. Oh, that was a little loud. This is on behalf of one of my coworkers who they unfortunately had to miss this session since they had an early flight back to Southern California. For the folks using MVC, I was wondering if Zend Framework kind of encourages you to do sort of lighter weight controllers, heavier controllers. What are your thoughts on that?
We recommended lighter weight controllers all along. So and actually, we make it easier, because with Zend Framework 1, you had you had to pull your dependencies in. So you go to the bootstrap or whatever, but you had to do it within the controller itself. Now you can write a factory for the controller and inject the dependencies up front. So that's done separately. So your code for the controller is, you might have a setter so that for each of the dependencies, but then you just assume that they've been set because it's being pulled out as a service. So it's actually a lot less code, which makes it a lot simpler to write, and fantastic experience for me, at least, every time I've had to use it. Any of you want to answer this one as well, or? Okay.
I would say what you said.
Okay. Do you have any other questions? You look like you had a list. So.
I'm taking notes as you're.
Okay. Okay, since somebody else is jumping up, here's another low ball. So each of you, what do you see? What do you see missing right now that you'd like to see in a future version of Zend Framework, either in ZF2 or ZF3?
The use of traits. We have a few places in Zend Framework 2 where traits would be very, very handy, because traits allow you to compose behavior into classes, and right now events are a good example. We actually provide a trait for events. We cannot use it because Zend Framework 2 has to work on PHP 5.3.3, but we provide it to you so you can use it. We would like to be able to use that kind of stuff internally. We have a lot of classes that are event manager aware. So we have a setter in each of those classes that looks pretty much identical, and it's about 8 to 10 lines of code, and that's just copy, paste code, duplicate code, and we cannot get rid of it because those classes need to extend another abstract class that may or may not compose the event manager, and you're just not, abstract classes are not appropriate for behaviors like that. So traits solve that problem, and I would really, really like to see that in Zend Framework 3.
So
Mike is the thinker here, evidently.
One of the things I'm still missing is an ORM layer inside of the Zend Framework itself. I know that was a plan for ZF2 at the very early stage and got kind of waylaid, I believe.
No, I never really planned on it.
It was in the wiki.
It was in the wiki. I didn't put it there.
Well, it's my opinion that we really need more competition in that space. Doctrine and Propel have basically locked that area down for PHP. And I'm sure there are some great smaller projects that just don't have the visibility to really step up and compete with them. So it's one of those things where I really would like to see like something like Zend step up and say, here's another alternative. Because it's painful. I mean, some of the things that Doctrine developers, for example, assume don't work for us. And this is really where alternatives really come into play really well. Because, yes, they're doing the same thing, but they do these same things in different approaches. And that really, it really depends on what approach you prefer and what approach you really need.
So Evan here told me to say documentation, which, we do need, but, seeing as I haven't even provided it for the component that I wrote, I mean, it's not very nice. Another thing that I was just thinking about is, kind of providing some abstract service layers, to better assist people to kind of create a more service-oriented architecture. I mean, more so that, like one of the reasons I don't like Doctrine as an ORM is that it kind of defeats the data mapper pattern to such a degree. But at the same point, you can still implement a data mapper with it. I just don't like Doctrine, okay? So, I mean, I think that it would be helpful to have kind of like a, kind of more like in some abstract services, or even being able to kind of provide some, simple mappers and kind of have that already built in, so it makes it a little bit easier for people coming on board that's not very familiar with the pattern to just actually get it done.
Very cool. Seriously, no other questions?
Hey, Ralph, a data mapper would be nice in ZenDB, just saying.
Where's Ralph? There we go. There we go.
Table gateway is a different pattern.
Yeah. Okay.
There's a question.
Yeah, we got a question.
So, Matthew, you talked about, the ability that we have now to, my kids, thank you. The ability we have to inject services or whatever into the controllers. A lot of times, though, like with ZF1, I created a service layer, but I would need, say, 3 different services for one controller action, and maybe only 2 of those for another controller action. Mm-hmm. Is there a way to specify that based on the action, only those certain services that I want to inject, or do those all get injected regardless?
So right now, it depends on how you write the factory. So if you write your factory to inject all of them at once, then that's what will be done. You can have some limited introspection at that point. You can grab the request or the router and find out some of that information. Honestly, if there are different paths, if there are different services based on different paths, separate it into multiple controllers. You're not going to lose anything by that, and now each controller is doing specific tasks, and so it's a little bit more clear what they are and why they need different dependencies. So that's usually the route I take. If I need that, you can do that. The other thing is you can also, the service manager gets injected if you're using the default ones, the default abstract controllers that we provide. It gets injected, so you can always pull those out and lazy load that way. I personally don't recommend it because I like the idea of being able to put in the substitutions and know up front what the dependencies are. But Ralph, on the other hand, one of my colleagues and on my team, he will argue exactly the opposite way. He says controllers are their own context. They should have their own service layer and everything. So it really depends on your philosophy there and what you're trying to accomplish and how you want to do things. I argue typically just try and be consistent about what you do so that it looks the same on each controller you do. And you're using the same pattern. If some are pulling out of this, having them injected, and others are pulling it out of the service locator, it's going to be harder for your developers to know when and how the dependencies get there.
A nice middle ground I've actually found with that too is if you do, for some reason, need to actually pull from the locator in your controller, wrap that in a getter in your controller. So you actually will have a getter inside that controller, check if that property in that controller is null, and then if it is null, pull it from the service locator, set it to the property, and then return the value of the property. The next time through, it won't pull it from the locator, it'll just return the property. Then you can also still have a setter. So for unit testing and stuff, you can just call the setter and then unit test your controller. And so that's kind of a good middle ground between dependency injection and the service locator pattern.
Question over here.
Don't start laughing. It will be. Okay. So my background is with another framework. With that framework, we're seeing a lot of conferences specific for that framework. And I hear there's one now for Zend Framework, but will there be more? Or what can people do to organize that? Because I think it's very good to have like specialist conferences, because you can go deeper into specific topics than with general conference like this.
I'm going to have to direct you over to Elaine over here, because I actually can't answer that question. Elaine is our Chief Marketing Officer, and she might be able to answer that. Do you want to try right now, Elaine, or do you want to just talk to him? Okay. Thanks, Scoop. Over here.
Is there an automated tool like ZF Tool in Zend Framework 2? And if there's not, is there plans to have something like that?
There are plans. So one of the things that happened as we came up into RC status was that a contributor did a whole bunch of work on console support. Things that include colorization, tabular display, being able to prompt for input and that sort of thing so that you can do console sorts of things. So this was really laying the groundwork for a new version of Zend Tool. Right now we're looking at it in terms of a module. I think we're calling, is it ZF Tool, the repository?
Yes.
I can't remember, I think it's called ZF Tool. So it's in the Zend Framework organization on GitHub. Unfortunately, that developer has been completely swamped, and so he hasn't been doing any work on it. So it's one of those things that we want to have a goal, but one of the things we also identified was that this is something that may need to change kind of outside the life cycle of the framework itself. So there are plans for it. Right now, it's not terribly necessary in terms of getting started with the project or with a module, because we have these skeleton apps. Most likely, any tooling we have will wrap those, but then also add some additional support on top of that. So, yeah, it's in the works. It's just, limited people who are have the time and
we accept pull requests.
What's that?
I said we accept pull requests.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we need pull requests, exactly. So,
thank you.
Yep.
Hi. Thank you guys for being out here. I just got one question. Is there going to be like a Zend Framework 2 Bug Hunt Day program starting soon?
I think so, yeah.
In January, we're expecting our third child, and you know how it goes.
So yeah, Mike will probably be starting those up pretty soon now, because now that we've got the schedule down and we've got our first, dot release after the stable release, I think we're going to start doing that, since we now every third Wednesday will be the release. We can start doing those again. So yeah, I really want to get those again, because they're fantastic for the community and getting it taken care of. Yeah.
Right.
It's actually interesting though. There's in some ways there's less need. We're getting fewer issues reported, and people are instead just giving us the fix, which is fantastic. So it ends up being on my back, because now I have to go and review all this code. But that's a great problem to have, really. So.
All right. Thank you.
What question could you possibly have, Rob?
I've got two.
Ooh.
So in case you don't know, Rob Allen here also goes by Acrobat. He wrote the tutorial for Zend Framework 1, adapted it for ZF2, and it's now our official tutorial. So he's a good guy.
Right, so with Zend Framework 2, Symfony 2, potentially Lithium as well, these frameworks are moving the complexity of the stuff you're using with PHP nowadays. Version control, event manager, etc. Sorry, it echoes. It's so we've got version control, now we've got event manager, we've got service manager, etc. How do you feel the learning curve is looking like for a new developer to PHP, getting stuck on a ZF2 project?
It's definitely increased greatly. I remember my barrier to entry with Zend Framework 1, and it made me feel like I was stupid for at least the first few days. And then I started getting into it. When we started working with Zend Framework 2, like really working with it, I felt that way again. So even going from Zend Framework 1 to 2, there is definitely a learning curve. And approaching it as a new developer, that's got to be a massive undertaking. So again, probably right now, the largest parts of the learning curve are lack of documentation, which, I mean, we're all aware that the team's working on it. It's just, it always lags behind the technology. So, but unfortunately, I mean, until the resources like another Zend Framework and Action book gets released, that curve is going to be fairly high.
Hit. I think Evan has an answer here as well.
Yeah, I actually have had the pleasure of training a couple people, actually complete junior developers from scratch to Zend Framework 2 developers, and it's been a unique experience. It is a larger learning curve. I'm not going to sugarcoat that, but I think that you should look at it as an investment because the result is better. You are going to save yourself time and money in the long run because you're going to be writing better software the first time instead of, ending up with something that you just have to rewrite anyway. So if you look at it that way, it's not so terrible, but yes, it is initially more of a learning curve to get started with what we have, at least at the moment.
You had a second question as well, or? Okay.
Also, could you comment a little bit on performance of Zend Framework 2, particularly compared to Zend Framework 1 and to the productivity improvements related to the better coding?
So I'm going to talk to one part about the benchmarks that people see, because a lot of people are using AB, and I promised Matthew a pull request a while ago, and I still haven't gotten to it. But the performance is a lot better than Zend Framework 1, in my opinion. It's just depending on how you use it. But in terms of benchmarks, I want to just kind of clear that part up because some people here may just go back and do a benchmark and try to run AB on it, which responds with HTTP 1.0 headers, and we reply with 1.1 headers, so it doesn't properly close the connection.
Yep.
So a lot of the benchmarks you see online are showing that. And so with that, I'll pass.
Yeah, we've been doing some benchmarking. Ralph is actually working on taking some real-world applications that are non-trivial. One of the differences with the architecture in Zend Framework 1 and 2, and you're well aware of this, Ralph, but it's for everybody else here. With Zend Framework 1, basically you initialize every resource on every request, whether or not it's going to be even used. With Zend Framework 2, if you're doing things properly, you're only doing the ones for the particular controller that you do. So when you have a non-trivial application that has a lot of resources in ZF1, performance is less than what you have in ZF2 because it's simply trying to load up a whole lot more. What we have done with some benchmarking recently is we're showing that with an opcode cache, the first request is over 100 milliseconds for fairly bare bones, but then it drops down to 20 to 30 milliseconds. And we actually did this on the Zend Framework website, and that's what we were seeing consistently. I can live with 20 to 30 milliseconds. But we are going to be, we are in the process of setting up these benchmarks, and we'll, of course, publish the methodology we used and the results of that so that people can compare and contrast.
So what do you expect Zend Framework 3 to? No, actually, it's actually a serious question. But I was curious if Zend Framework 3, with Zend Framework 2, there was a lot of changes. It was a really big backwards compatibility break. Do you expect the same thing to happen going forward, or would it be more of an iterative process with fewer BC breaks between major versions?
Yeah, that's the plan right now. We had, it's a 5-year difference between Zend Framework 1 and 2, and so there were a lot of things that had to change. We had huge backwards compatibility breaks. But that, of course, is part of what you do with the major version. That's when you can break things, right? And sometimes they just need to be broken. Our plan at this point is to be more iterative and have these major releases much closer together. So we're looking at 18 to 24 months between the major releases, which will give us a chance to break less and make it a much better experience for the end user migrating from one version to the next. It also means that hopefully we'll be then mirroring similar life cycle with PHP so that we're able to kind of adopt the new features a little more quickly than we have been in the past, which I know Evan really wants traits. So and with 5.4 out for a year now, it seems like, well, why aren't we on 5.4? But yeah, that's the plan at this point. We don't want to make it easier for end users and yet at the same time be able to make those architectural changes that we need to more frequently with less impact.
Thank you.
Are we supposed to stop, Kent? Okay. Is there one more question? Okay, we've got one. Excellent.
I'd just like to expand a little bit more about the learning curve question. You hear all the time, don't reinvent the wheel, but the wheel has been reinvented many times over the centuries, from a stone wheel to what we've got on our cars now. So I don't agree with that philosophy. The learning curve may be a little bit higher, but PHP has come a long way over the years with how people are using it. Where would you draw the line between just consuming a framework and building things with the framework and actually understanding what the framework is doing in the back end? Like, would you encourage the people who use Zend Framework to look into, what the modules are doing and what everything is doing, versus just being a consumer? Because I see a lot of job applications where they say, oh, I use Zend Framework, and you start probing into it and they don't understand what's actually going on in the back end.
Yes. Look at the source code. I think that is absolutely critical. There is a big difference between a developer that can use a framework and a developer that understands the framework. And if you make yourself that developer that understands the framework, that will set you apart, and that will allow you to write much better software. The documentation can only take you so far. It'll show you examples and explain what the public interfaces have, but having a deeper understanding of what it's actually doing in certain places is going to allow you to make decisions when you're writing your software that will result in you having better software. So absolutely. In fact, I use the source code as my first source of documentation and then go to the documentation only if I need an example. So I would encourage everybody to do the same. It's the best and the always most up-to-date source of documentation is the source code. So.
One thing we've tried very hard, especially as we came into RC status, was actually to really consolidate the patterns that were being used. So one thing with Zend Framework 2 is there are really two core patterns, and it's inversion of control with the service manager. So if you understand the service manager well, that's going to get you a long ways. And the other part is the event system and understanding that how event listeners are done and how to trigger events. When you understand those two well, you're going to see that throughout the framework. And so that's where I would direct people to learn right now in Zend Framework 2. But as Evan says, reading code is never a bad thing. You're going to always learn. Okay. Our MC is coming on stage.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank these guys for their time. I think they put on a pretty good closing keynote here, and I'd like to give them all a round of applause. So we have one other person that we need to acknowledge. And we have a lovely parting gift for this person. So a person who has actually toiled a lot here at ZendCon and really helped support the community is Michelangelo and the Uncons. And so I want to have Michelangelo come up on stage here and collect his giant jumbo version of the green elephant. So. You're welcome. Everybody, I think, everybody knows how much Michelangelo works and all the great stuff he does with the show in Benelux and everything else. So nobody could deserve a big, giant green elephant more than Michelangelo. All right, well, thank you, and I hope you appreciate it, but I know you deserve it, definitely. Now, we do have one more of these little gems. Hope you filled out your conference evaluation forms. If you didn't, not only did you not get a t-shirt, but you're kind of screwed on this deal too. So here is this other one. I'm going to bring up my lovely assistant here. For those of you that don't know Stephanie, Stephanie runs our office, which means she keeps Andy under control, which by itself is pretty impressive. And she's decked out today in official orange and black because of the Giants' great win last night. Now we're going to have Stephanie, I'm going to sort of fan these. We're going to have Stephanie reach in with her lovely claw. And since she has an affinity to elephants, especially Mrs. Elephant, we'll see if she can pull out one and see who wins this. So just stick in here wherever you want and wherever you stick your hand in. Okay. This person, read the name. Who have we got?
Eugene Ritter.
Eugene Ritter, are you here? No Eugene Ritter. Okay, another attempt at the claw.
David Weintraub.
David Weintraub, yeah, all right. Thank you. All right, see, that's what you get when you fill out your conference evaluation. I think we have one more sort of sitting on the stage, unless you weren't going to throw that. You know, I don't know. Oh, he got it to 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth row. Nice arm. Nice arm. So I got just a couple of closing slides. I thought I'd go through a few funny things that happened to the elephants here. So I created something called Where's Robin? I started out with Where's Waldo, but it was pointed out to me that while the elephant doesn't seem to be able to fold origami very well, those of you that don't know, that's our origami elephant from last year it's standing on. We did have somebody decide that the name of the elephant was officially Robin. So Bobby, you get the name rights to the elephant. That's Robin the elephant now. Matthew decided that Robin should go get some lunch. So Matthew took Robin to lunch, and elephants do like to eat, we know that. Someone decided that the elephant should go swimming, but apparently the elephants don't like water. Now, that seemed all sort of mundane, so somebody decided the elephant should even go to the Golden Gate Bridge. And I get the question, is this photoshopped? I have no idea. Somebody posted it on their Twitter. So they either went with the elephant. Is this person here, by the way? No? Okay, so we'll never know. I'm sure someone will now investigate, dig into this, you know, look at it, say it's photoshopped because there's 6 pixels. Who cares? It's funny. Really. And so then Bobby's decided that the elephant was tired. Well, you know, if you'd gone to lunch and then gone to the pool and then gone to the Golden Gate Bridge, you might be tired too. But I'm convinced that the elephant was tired for the same reason many of you are tired. And that's because the elephant had a little too much, maybe, and kind of overslept. And now, like all of you, the elephants are getting ready to go home and do some coding, so they're waiting here anxiously at the door as you're all waiting to get out of here. So the last parting shot for you guys is, that's all, folks. All the elephants are leaving the building. Thank you very much. Enjoy your trip home. I hope you enjoyed the conference. By the way, for the young people, this is elephant walk, okay? For us old people, we know that.